In my books, I often mention titanic forces that rule this world, or that affect us human beings in one way or another. Quite often, in trying to describe my perceptions and the techniques of inner alchemy, I will reference in small ways the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, and how it is that a great deal of what he wrote about, dealing with awesome cosmic entities that live in other dimensional locations that intertwine with this one, tends to greatly mirror what I have been able to perceive myself, using those techniques that I write about. I am, for example, as an inner alchemist, a practicing projectionist myself, and as such it is the case that using such techniques along with many of the others that I describe in the books that I write, specifically the course books within the Magnum Opus trilogy, I have been able to directly perceive titanic forces, entities, powers, of such magnitude and, in some ways horror, that I am often left quite numb after such encounters. I have been asked on a number of occasions to try and talk in more detail about these awesome beings. I, as a general rule, only write and talk about certain things that are general in nature, instead of focusing on my personal perceptions. My focus is the general current of inner alchemy, and this is so because to focus directly on just my personal perceptions is a kind of focus on the self that I am not really interested in, but I do believe that there is some merit in trying to describe these cyclopean, to borrow a Lovecraft word, forces. I feel that it is important to describe these forces because in doing so, these descriptions might help those that are using the techniques that I speak of, or are using similar techniques. For that reason, perhaps if they are new to these endeavors, they might find it very relevant to them in that it might help to explain some of the things that they might have been able to perceive themselves, things that they might have trouble putting into words or perhaps even understanding to one degree or another. In order to describe what I directly perceive, that is, I must discuss my personal perceptions, and it is my hope that you will forgive me for any egoistic points of view in this particular video. It is not my hope to aggrandize myself in any way. It is only my hope that this material might help those that are interested in this particular current of perception. It is also my belief that anyone can have the kind of perceptions that I can have. All that you need to do is just follow those techniques that you personally believe work. Techniques that can push you past the limited cube of perception that traps most of humanity into thinking that the world is such an ordinary place. I feel that if you continue in that process, in the same way that you would continue with any kind of academic work, and in doing so develop the skills required, you too will be able to perceive those things that others believe to be impossible. With that being said, I must begin by stating that it is the case for me that I was never very much interested in the work of H.P. Lovecraft or any of the work that came after as a result of his original material that is now referred to as cosmicism, and has to do with the existence of abysmal beings and realities just on the outer edge of human perception. But, as my own ability to perceive grew, I was inescapably drawn to the writings of H.P. Lovecraft because as I was able to pick up snippets from these writings, small quotes here and there as you may run into from time to time, I was able to realize that what he was writing about were in essence those very same things that I was now perceiving. It took me a long time to overcome certain difficulties, certain prejudices perhaps, that I was having within trying to pick up one of his books and read it, and in time I did realize that these difficulties stemmed from the fact that I was judging this work by the interpretations of those that were trying to either describe his work or critique it in some way. I would read something about the original material, and I would find it to be quite interesting to some degree, but at the same time I just took it to be something along the lines of an artist being able to pick up the underlying tone of reality, as most artists can. Artists, being closer to the unconscious aspects of themselves, can pick up on realities that average people cannot, and this is what I believed was happening here. But, when I was finally able to pick up an actual book and read his material personally, I was struck by the fact that this was not simply an artist picking up on the underlying tone of reality, this was a practicing dreamer, a powerful projectionist, an astral traveler that was quite simply writing, or giving a spin, to what he could perceive directly. He was, quite simply doing the only thing that a dreamer could if they were far smarter than I, and that was to turn all those things that are what I refer to as energetic truths, and present those things before others as fiction, as very creative and completely original horror fiction. What a laugh I had, what a stroke of genius. HP, like we all need to do, needed to make a living, needed to pay for his life. As such, it is my belief, at least this is my personal opinion only, that he felt at that time that he could not write about what he was perceiving directly in an autobiographical manner. He could not, again this is my opinion only, write about those things that he could see directly, that he could dream about and project into, directly, openly, as fact. I feel that what he did was that he took those things that he knew to be true, because he was in essence a person that could project out into those odd dimensions and see, and turn those other dimensional world projections into the only thing that was sane at that time, and that is horror fiction, short stories, weird tales, to pay the bills. The fact that he changed an entire genre, actually created one really, is only a small sample of the great power of those things that he witnessed as a dreamer, as a projectionist, as an astral traveler of strong ability. I mention this author here, because in order to describe those things that I see, I find myself needing to use those same words, that I feel he was forced to use. I see these things in the same way that this dreamer saw them, and of great surprise and pleasure to me, is the fact that it was only after I began to use these words myself, that I discovered that someone else had beaten me to the punch. HP is in essence an incredibly delightful verification of my own seeing. Now, how is it that those things exist and what it is that those things are, is something that in most ways is quite literally beyond words, and yet we can make an attempt, and in doing so, we will fall under that criticism that is always levied upon H.P. Lovecraft, and that is that in order to describe these incredible forces we must use a large amount of adjective, and an odd kind of cynicism, that comes from seeing the true nature of reality. In describing these cyclopean outer things, we can begin by saying that, such forces are things that cannot be seen in whole for the most part, that is they are so great in their powers, so titanic, so big and powerful essentially, that one cannot see a whole thing most of the time. The most that one can do is to see pieces of them, parts of them, as they expand, roll, and unfold themselves across dimensional fields that are beyond anything that can be referred to as rational space-time. I have tried to describe many times how space and time are not the same thing depending on which dimensional field you may find yourself in. How each dimensional field can have its own, and oftentimes quite different, laws of space and time, and in doing so, I have tried to introduce the ideas of intensity, of vibrational differences, of feeling sense, and of all sorts of different energetic properties that must be used when one goes into those odd dimensions, and finds him or herself in a different dimensional location where space and time follow rules that do not apply here in this objective, and most rational realm. Such titanic forces, like the Archon for example, are beings that occupy so much space, that possess so much gravity, that they cannot be measured as being whole entities, as you might see a whale or even a distant planet for example. Instead they occupy different positional locations that cross dimensional barriers, and each of these positional locations become like whole perceptive angles that then need to be combined, to allow you to try to perceive the wholeness of something that quite literally bends around the corners of the best perceptive mechanisms available to a human. In the simplest of ways, you could think of it sort of like the compound eyes of an insect, a fly. Each one of the refractions within the compound eyes of this insect perceives one particular angle or dimensional field. The insect's brain then takes these many different angles and combines them to create a whole aspect of something. In the same way, these titanic forces cannot be perceived wholly most of the time. Instead, different angles need to be put together in order to try to create a whole. And it is even the case that some of these angles, some of these dimensional aspects, are beyond human potential, so at best you may at times find yourself trying to put together refractions that have no semblance of rational order. When this happens, if these refractions are alien enough, a seer can go mad. I feel that it is for this reason that you would find the obscure descriptions, incomplete seemingly at times, of such forces in the work of H.P. Lovecraft. This is the real reason for the murkiness, the jet black ink quality of the descriptions of those colossal things that haunt the outer darkness of his writings. He was never able to truly describe completely, wholly, in rational language, those things that he saw. He failed to some degree, if you feel as others that his monsters were never really brought into the light of total revelation. And I, being not in any way equal to the descriptive verse of this master, have failed as well. But in my own defense, I have a motive, and he had his own motive I suppose as well. His was to add to the horror by keeping things murky, and mine is to use this failure of language to impel you, to try to entice you, to have you practice those techniques that can get you there yourself. I have always rejected dogma. I much prefer that you become a projectionist, an astral traveler, a dreamer, a seer yourself, and see. I am not sure though, once you can see these Herculean outer things yourself, if there is a way to use language and any rational descriptives that would truly in some way give justice to the enormous proportions of those things that occupy these huge dimensions, and that are made up of angular parts, of a type of ethereal corpus, that are not only beyond three-dimensional descriptives, but are also so alien in aspect as to drive a sane person mad. There are titanic forces that watch over humanity, and to them we are nothing more than specks to be either exploited or ignored. Such forces are of such awesome proportions that they can dwarf continents, the seas, and even the supposed perfect sphere upon which we exist. Such forces to us can be more akin to giant tides that cross the galaxies, that batter this very planet and move it along in ways that are most unsuspected. There are beings of different sizes that occupy different geographical locations as well. Certainly, I for example have been able to witness a great being of titanic proportions that lives at the bottom of the Bosporus Strait next to Istanbul, and while this being was epic in its size, and while its machinations as it fed off of the people of that city were indeed chilling beyond reason, its proportions and abilities were nothing compared to some of the bigger beings that exist out there in cosmic space. I have been able to directly perceive non-organic life forms that are as tall as skyscrapers, that roll in from the Pacific into the coasts of Mexico, and feed from the energy of all the people that bathe and live at the edges of that sea. Such beings are spectacular and they can leave you breathless. They are amazing to witness and truly terrifying, but such terror is very human in a way because in their gigantic dimensions they are still within the conception of something measurable, and their doings are such that they fit within the realm of human descriptive possibility, no matter how odd and grandiose, or predatory, those doings might be. But beyond all such things, even though there are things on this earth bigger than this, scattered across the geography of this planet, these outer forces that I have witnessed and that I believe H.P. Lovecraft witnessed and tried to describe in his short, supposedly fiction, stories, are so beyond all this, so massive, so alien, so immense in intellect and scope from the human perspective that really the best that writers can do is to lose themselves in adjectives, allegory, hyperbole, and partial and fractured description. If you have ever looked at a great ceiling, like the dome of a great cathedral, or you have looked into a great pit, a deep well along the lines of the Grand Canyon perhaps, you will note that there are moments when such sights, such large open spaces can overwhelm rationality and perception. To look into such abyss, such abysmal things, is the phobia, the kenophobia, of looking into the cyclopean other that exists in the odd dimensions beyond scope and visible conception. Physical eyes cannot perceive those titanic forces that I'm trying to describe here, and even though those inner senses that are used to perceive these forces are of a far greater power, even these inner senses can have trouble with such perceptions. The Archon was, the Archon is, the Archon shall always be. We are tiny little specks floating across the inky blackness of the dark sea, and I do feel that the time has come for us to realize just how small we are. Humanity needs a great deal of self-awareness at this point in time, and nothing but a glimpse into these titanic and alive, sentient, predatory in ways beyond reason, forces, will allow humanity to truly understand its position in this infinity we call life. The reason why we must realize just how small we are is because we can learn to become more. But the only way that we can do that is if we first understand just how little we are at the moment. While it may seem like I am a bit of a cosmicist, like H.P. was, while it might seem like I am a cynic about humanity and our ability to become a true interplanetary race, I do not perceive that we are doomed to be some small speck civilization controlled by forces beyond measure, for all time. I am instead a cosmist. I do believe that we can let go of this tiny world and hurl ourselves into infinity and join those great powers out there. But to do this I perceive directly that we must let go of those oh so human aspects of ourselves that keep us here, stark, small, petty. We can take our place amongst those great proportions, and fly beyond all conception of measure and possibility. But first we must let go of the small in us, and there is no better way to do this than to see just how big those outer forces are, how mammoth and mammon our obstacles are, how big we must become, if we are to have any hope to survive. To quote H.P. Lovecraft, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far." I personally feel that this isn't pessimism, it's a challenge. A fantastic challenge worthy of us, worthy of what we can become if we can only learn to truly see. The feel of a wave as it crashes across your body is but a small tactile and tangible brush or push, by a titanic force, an ocean perhaps, that may span half the globe. You can feel the power of this wave as you stand by a beach somewhere, and as it forces you back, you can imaginatively conceptualize the massive ocean that is the source of this wave. There are other kinds of waves, and some of these waves are the result of things far bigger than any earthly ocean, and these forces are sentient things, cunning things, epic things, that exist in places so dark that no physical eye could ever hope to perceive them. We can go beyond the physical eye, the physical senses. This is my message. In case you are interested in the inner alchemy techniques that I write about, that can allow you to see those titans if you dare, I will leave a link to the first 2 course books in the Magnum Opus trilogy, and let you know that I am currently writing the 3rd course book in that trilogy, and hope to be done soon. In this trilogy of books you will find all of the information needed to start your own journeys into that oddly angled reality beyond the walls of average perception.